Okay, so thank you so much, Nivedita, for joining for my podcast. And I know that like the reason why I reached out to you was because of your book, because I already got my hands on this, and I have been. I think I read this book initially when we were about to record it earlier, and then I again read this book to get the whole gist again few days back, so I can just come up with good questions and like challenge you for your own book. So yeah, and like people might say that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I think I would judge this book by its cover because it's fantastic. The way Alexander has illustrated the front page, it's really good. And I know the book is amazing too from the inside. So yeah, let's dive into this and talk about the book. So yeah, just tell me about yourself and like what inspired you to basically co-author this book and what has been uh happened like so far.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me on your podcast. So I'm Nivedita Ganesh, and I grew up in the UK in Manchester, and then I did my undergrad in Chennai Mathematical Institute. I studied maths and computer science. That's where my journey with maths began. And then I went to NYU and studied an MS in computing, entrepreneurship, and innovation.
Mhm.
That is when I met Professor Bud Mishra. So
Okay.
he is the primary author of this book. Me and another student, Inavamsi Enaganti, we wrote this under his guidance.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I graduated directly into the pandemic in 2020.
Okay.
So at that time, Inav and I joined Professor Bud's think tank called RX Covia, and
Uh-huh.
we did a lot of research in game theory and strategy. So there were lots
Hmm.
of different parts of the think tank, epidemiology,
Mm.
biology, data science. So we were doing game theory,
Okay.
and we did simulations, we did all sorts of different things. And what came out of our research during that time was actually two papers,
Uh-huh.
which was on policy making
Hmm.
and on clinical trials during pandemics.
Okay.
And one of those papers got picked up by the National
Uh-huh.
Academy of Inventors Journal,
Uh-huh.
and it was the clinical trials one. And we called it Inventions of Interventions
Uh-huh.
and Data-Driven Strategies of Pandemic Control. So that's the paper. And from that, we got a book deal.
Yeah.
So we were really excited when we got the book deal. I mean, it was
Uh-huh.
mainly Professor Bud who got the book deal, but he said that, we could help him write something for
Yeah.
it. And originally they actually said, like, we want you to write a textbook for Professor Bud's course, which is on social networks. And Inav and I were a bit like, cool, like writing a textbook. I mean,
Uh,
we can do a
that's a big
survey
thing,
of
That's a
different.
big thing. That's a big thing
Exactly.
to that. Yeah.
It's a big thing to do. It's a
Yeah.
tough thing to do, but we were also like not sure if we wanted to just make it all nonfiction and do a bunch of different paradoxes and biases and
Uh-huh.
myths and just list them out. We were like, I
Uh-huh.
don't think that's the right way to learn these kind of
Yeah.
concepts. So that's when to the publisher we kind of pitched a book of fictional short stories. We gave them a
Uh,
sample, they liked it, and
uh-huh.
then that's kind of how this book was born. We were writing it for like probably a year and a half, editing it and illustrating it probably for another year and a half. And now, after it's launched, it's actually been prescribed as a textbook at NYU for
Oh,
Prof. Bud's
that's
course.
great. Yeah. That's
So
great.
right now, in fact, students are using this textbook and
Uh-huh.
studying with it, which is amazing for us to have
Yeah.
people read it and learn from it.
Uh-huh.
And, it's been added to the Library of Congress, the British Library Catalog. So it's globally been accepted.
Uh-huh.
And just to talk a bit about the book itself. So you've read it, it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to explain in a
Exactly.
nutshell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Got a lot of different things going on. Each
Yeah.
chapter is completely different.
Yeah.
But to try and summarize it, it's like an invitation to discover the beauty and chaos of scientific discovery and
Mm-hmm.
we're using the lens of data-driven narratives. So we explore a bunch of different counterintuitive topics like AI ethics, fake data
Mm-hmm.
detection, game theory, paradoxes, and lots more. The
Mm-hmm.
idea is to make all these concepts very accessible and engaging and relatable to readers from different walks of life.
Yeah.
So yeah, regardless of your background in mathematics, I would
Uh-huh.
say it's a must read for everyone.
No, yeah, actually, I was able to understand like whole bit of it because the way you guys have explained it, the stories, and every chapter has a different method to like explain the concept, like a different like a letter way, and then like stories, small stories, and everything. It was really good. So like because when you talked about the topics which you have explained, like game theory, it's pretty like difficult topics, and I know a lot of things in this book are like from different concepts of paradoxes and or like psychological concepts like confirmation bias and everything. People on an average like don't know about these concepts, and the way you have explained it, like putting out the heading and then explaining that topic and story in a story way, so that was really amazing. So like because being a mathematician like you have done in your like past academic career, how did you like get this inspiration of like what were the main authors did you refer to to come up with these stories eventually, because with that pragmatic mindset then coming into a storytelling mindset, that's difficult. So
Yeah, for sure. Firstly, I'm really happy you enjoyed the book. Like, it's so
yeah.
exciting to talk to people who read the book.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's a good question. I mean, our aim was to like make all these complex ideas
Mhm.
accessible. I is the main idea. So we were
Yeah.
trying to think how to make people learn and remember this material. And it
Mhm.
always helps when they're like curious. So when they're curious and drawn in by the characters and the stories, we thought it would be much more interesting. And to put all
Yeah.
of these paradoxes and biases in real life scenarios, it makes it memorable. And when you're living your life, you can be like, oh, I think this one is at play, sunk cost bias
Yeah.
is happening now or
Yeah.
something. So, like the authors and influences that I think, I mean, many people were involved in this book, but for myself, I would say, like,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of Monty Python. It's this old, like, British comedy troupe. So they're
Uh-huh.
really absurd, okay? They are like, they push the boundaries of imagination to convey different concepts. And
Mhm.
when I say absurd, I mean, like, it's not even realistic many times. It'll be completely out of this world, but
Mhm.
it's like captures a point, It's
Yeah.
satirical comedy for them, but for us, we were putting things in completely different worlds
Yeah.
to try and convey different points. I would also say, Neil Gaiman. I'm not sure if you've
Yeah.
heard of him.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I've heard this name. Yeah, I've heard this name.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's an amazing author, and
Uh-huh.
his books have been made into TV shows and movies. And I
Uh-huh.
feel like his humor is so clever, and
Uh-huh.
he just like peppers it everywhere, and
Yeah.
it makes people so interested in what's going to happen
Yeah.
next and the characters. I mean, humor is really hard to write in, so we tried our best. But
No, I think you were pretty successful because I just got reminded of one of the section in your book when you were talking about COVID-19, and
mhm.
the way you were writing it, like it's like now I have done my monologue. I know it's a lot, so you were just trying to communicate with the reader, even if I'm not present there. You're trying to communicate with the reader, like and like coming from a different background and just writing this kind of book, it's like very commendable. Yeah, yeah.
Yay, I'm happy.
Yeah. All right. Like, I really want to get like deep dive into the book. And when I was reading it, like one of the first thing which like very much resonated with me was like I think a lot of the most of the book talks about the group behavior and like group thinking. And there was a chapter called Fakebook, I think, in which you
Mhm.
mentioned like hate as a common uniting force for people, worldwide. Like, can you like explain this to me and like how this is reflected in the human nature and what exactly came to your mind when you were like, writing this?
Okay. Well, no points for guessing what fake book is a parody of,
Uh,
but it's a famous social network, is all I'll say.
okay.
Um, so, I mean, we were parodying one of the famous social networks,
Yeah.
and we were thinking like you know, the famous adage, which is, your enemy's enemy is your friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we were thinking, we were playing with that, and we switched the like button into a hate
Uh-huh.
button, and
Yeah.
the entire thing was like flipped. But
Flipped. Yeah.
interestingly, like when you describe or think of how the social network would actually work, it's
Uh-huh.
kind of similar to how it works now, which was
Yeah.
strange. But if you think about it, I mean, even now with the like button where, people are following or liking things that they like,
Hmm.
people still, get into echo chambers, and they'll be in their bubble. They'll only hear things that them and their friends hear. And
Mm.
that also means that, the algorithms that they use,
Mm.
they reward kind of incendiary and divisive narratives,
Yeah.
which kind of just polarizes people even more. It just
Hmm.
divides people, which, I mean, when social networks were created, the idea
Mm.
was to bring people together and
Yeah.
make communities.
Yeah.
Whereas what you find in real
Mm.
life is something quite different now, what it's turned
Hmm.
into. So we were kind of playing with that and we flipped it. But I mean, is it what's really there now? I don't know.
But still, like, there is a community. We can call it hate community because people are coming here to hate a lot of people. And you know what? Algorithm plays a like huge role in this because I was watching this reel. So I saw a reel on Ram Mandir or something because at that time, and I just watched this reel for like 60 to 70%, like the 60 to 70% of the reel I watched it. And like after two reels, I got another Ram Mandir reel. Like I don't know, like this, how these algorithms are designed, and like they tend to, make you fall in that particular group which you belong, which you don't think
Yeah.
you belong, but you eventually fall into that kind of group. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Like whether you think it or not, they'll almost make you think it by placing you on a journey that gets you there. It's
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of,
And they make you, like in mathematical terms, they make you belong to a sample data set which you think is a population set. For example, if I think
oh,
I'm getting some sort of reels and I think this is how the world is, but no, this is not how the world is. This is a like very small sample which you are getting because just based on your algorithm. And we tend to see the world based on that content, which is not true. Which
yeah,
is also believe. Yeah,
exactly. You get into your little bubbles and then you think that's everything. You don't see the
exactly.
other point of view. I mean, it's kind of dangerous, really.
Yeah, yeah, actually, yeah. And I think in this, like when we move forward, there's a quote which you mentioned from Albert Einstein. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Like this is something interesting and deep. How do you explain this quote in your this chapter, Fakebook?
Okay, well, I think Einstein, I mean, his idea was that, he didn't know what World War III was going to be fought with, but potentially it would be nuclear warfare. And then after that, the world would just, I mean, it would be completely different from what we know it. It would collapse as
Yeah,
we know it. So I think the idea that he was getting at and that we were also alluding to is that, humans are flawed. I mean, we
yeah,
can be incredibly amazing, show so much love. We can also be terrible. I mean, I'm
yeah,
not saying each one of us, all of us, can be either extreme and anything in between. And that's
right.
kind of the beauty of human experience, some people say. I mean, many poems and books have been written about this. So,
Uh-huh.
what we were trying to explore is kind of how people can be a little bit more rational about things.
Mm.
Like, they say that all conflicts arise from desire, whether
Yeah.
for love, land, or power, right? So,
Mm.
I mean, they just say that these are the main reasons that conflicts
Yeah.
arise. So, in this kind of situation, how can we work towards being a little bit more logical and ease these drivers of human tension and desires, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that we were trying to explore, but
Mm.
we'll see
No, I
how much
think
impact it has.
This is because I just like thought something when you said, people need to think rationally. And I think on a primitive level, people think rationally, primitive level. But because we are in a community, because we are in a group, that changes because of the group behavior. Because we tend to think alike. Because I don't want to think in like different from other people. Then
Yeah.
I won't be able to like call myself the part of that group. I don't want to like get separated from. I want some sort of association. And this is something very important because I was reading this concept in psychology called social identity theory, and it
Hmm.
told about this that people want to call themselves some part of a group which is elite in their point of view,
Hmm.
and that's something different. I made a reel on this. Like people who watches Bollywood, um, say like if someone comes in and say that I watch Hollywood movies, he want to like sound cool. If someone is saying that I slept at one, then a friend will come, no bro, I slept at two. And this changes like see the paradox here. If I say that I woke up at 6 a.m., I wanted to be productive today and I woke up at 6 a.m. A friend of mine will come and say, bro, I woke up at 5 a.m. So, you know how it changes. Like, here I'm fighting to sleep late and here I'm fighting to wake up early. We just want to like
Mm,
associate ourselves in a group which is cooler in the view of other people. So, actually, this happens and
yeah.
people lose their rationality and pragmatic thinking completely. So, yeah. Yeah, so next I want to like move forward, like which is very interesting, because when I was discussing about the podcast, I was talking to Vash and like we discussed about the story, when it comes to logical fallacies and misinterpretation. She was telling me about this Cobra effect which happened in India. And I really want you to like shed light upon that and like explain what exactly happened. It's very interesting, I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic story, true story. So I'll set you back in time to the British Raj. So when the
Mhm.
British were here and in charge,
Yeah.
well, they were scared of cobras and they wanted to reduce the number. They wanted to
Yeah.
get rid of them, basically.
Yeah.
So what they did is they put a monetary reward, they put a bounty on all cobras that were captured and handed in to them. Well,
Mm.
Indians, they are very innovative, or jugaad, if you want,
Jugaad.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what they did is that they started actually rearing
Mm.
cobras to get the reward. And then, I mean, when the British realized this, they
Yeah.
were like, they stopped the
Mm.
bounty.
Yeah.
And then the Indians were like, if there's no bounty, what are we rearing these cobras for? They released all the cobras that they had
Mhm.
grown. At the end, there were more cobras than when they started.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this completely backfired on the British. It was mayhem. This is an
Yeah.
example of perverse incentives. So, Goodman's law, which is when a
Uh-huh.
measure becomes a target, it
Mhm.
ceases to be a good measure.
Oh,
So, this is what it's a good example of.
yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think this is the similar kind of thing when it comes to like logical fallacies and like misinterpretation. This same thing happened in COVID. And I think I observed that too because I was also part of that. And when
Hmm.
you come out of that, again, it's a group behavior because you don't want to like fight from the group when you are in the group. So when you come out, you see,
Yeah.
okay, was I right? Was I wrong? What happened exactly? And I think you talked about that like thing in your book, the like how lockdowns will like have no effect and people were thinking that it has a lot of effect. So again, like can you tell me about that, how that is a logical fallacy and like misinterpretation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, back in COVID, there was all sorts of things being said, all sorts of things being published. Anyone who was around at that time knows it was quite confusing for the average person. So, I mean, one thing that was published was that lockdowns have no effect.
Mhm.
This, the paper that actually talked about this was actually succumbing to something called confirmation bias.
Okay.
This is a very big bias. It's very common. It's quite famous also. It's basically when we focus on evidence that
Mhm.
confirms our beliefs or the
Yeah.
hypothesis that we've made,
Yeah.
and we overlook trends that contradict what we
Mm.
want to see. It's a
Yeah.
very common thing for humans to do, really. Focus on what agrees with them, right?
Common for Indians, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, for
Yeah.
everyone, really. So, I mean, the reason this happened was because the study was conducted and based solely on R naught values. So
Mm,
R naught value is basically how contagious a disease is, or
mm,
how many people one infected person would infect on average.
right.
So that is definitely something to consider,
Mhm,
but it overlooked other factors like, you know, demographics, how many people were vaccinated, what the
mm,
climate was like,
yeah.
cultural factors. Because, I mean, for instance, if you look at a family in India, an average family in India versus an average family, say, in Iceland or something, I mean,
Mm,
India is very dense. Sometimes they
yeah.
tend to have larger families. Iceland is not that densely populated. I mean, people are much more spread apart. I
Spread
mean,
out.
each
Yeah.
place is completely different. So you have to
Mm,
consider a lot of different factors.
yeah.
So this was definitely an example of
Yeah.
confirmation bias. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and there was one more example which you mentioned in the book. It was about um like how people wearing masks got COVID, and it was a like misinterpretation of the statistics, like how this happens. And then you gave an example of how if you say that 100% people placed are from NYU, and there was something like that. Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah.
That was something very interesting.
If I remember correctly, I
Yeah.
think that was an example of prosecutor's fallacy. And that's a
Yeah.
causal fallacy, which is basically Bayesian probability, in
Yeah.
case you're familiar, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like saying 100% of people who got a job are from
Mm,
NYU instead of saying 100% of people from NYU got a
got it.
job. I mean,
Yeah.
they mean completely different things.
Yeah.
But this kind of causal fallacy is actually made quite often. And the reason
Uh-huh.
it's called prosecutor's fallacy is because it happens in the courtroom all the time. So, I mean, that's really
Ah,
worrying, right?
yeah.
We give
Yeah.
another example of it in the courtroom as well.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, it can ruin lives. So,
Yeah. I know. Yeah, no, I think this is very interesting. Like one of the chapters which I really liked was this fight because I have been to that phase and it was like, okay, oh,
yeah,
this happened, oh, this happened. So I was like getting that, sort of things when I was reading it.
yeah.
Yeah. And like you have talked about a lot of biases and paradoxes, and I really want to I want you to explain that in detail, like cognitive biases which happen, sunk cost bias, zero sum bias. Like, can you like break it down and explain like how this affect our perception when we, see anything?
Okay. Okay, so I'll explain the two that you mentioned, but there are many more also. So, for instance, sunk cost bias or sunk cost fallacy is
Mhm.
basically when people tend to continue their endeavor because they have spent, lots of time, effort, and money, and even after it doesn't make sense to continue it, they still continue it just because of the sunk costs of what they've spent. So I'll give you an
Uh,
example to kind of illustrate this. A very popular example, which is, in the stock markets, right?
mm,
So suppose an investor or just anyone like me or you, I mean,
mm,
we bought a stock, okay? And the stock is declining.
yeah,
And you've already invested a lot of money in it, but it's going down.
yeah,
So, in this situation, you could sell it and avoid further losses, at least, cut your
yeah,
losses. Or if you're driven by your emotional attachment to the
mm,
money that you've already sunk into the investment,
yeah,
then you can hold and you're not making a rational assessment of the future potential, but you're holding
yeah,
it and the stock continues to go down. And then
mm,
you lose all the money that was invested. So,
yeah,
I mean, this happens a lot.
yeah.
It's it's something to watch out for sure.
Yeah. No, this is again like the example of people thinking irrational and not making logical and pragmatic decisions. And I think this happens every time. We do this a lot. Like even it's a big psychological problem which a lot of people have. And yeah, this happens a lot. Also, like, can you talk about the cognitive biases? Because I think confirmation bias is one of the cognitive bias, right?
Yeah, confirmation bias is one of them. That's the one that
Yeah.
we just talked about. And then
Uh-huh.
another one is zero-sum bias that you said, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
that one is a bit game theoretic. It's quite
Mm,
fun, but it's basically like a zero-sum game is
mm-hmm.
when one person's loss is another's gain.
Yeah,
So that means, it'll sum to zero is the idea.
yeah.
So, I mean, the example in the book was a COVID example
Mm,
also, which was basically like, suppose one country is hoarding supplies. They're
mm,
hoarding like masks, for
yeah.
instance, okay? So they're buying all the masks that are available and they're like,
Mm,
we want them all. We want our citizens
mm,
to be safe.
mm,
They think that if they get the masks,
mm,
then the other person is not getting it and that's going to be better for them.
mm.
But that's not the actual situation because
Yeah.
if they take all the masks, then their
Uh,
neighboring country won't have enough. And
uh,
the spread of disease there will increase and there will be more variants. It'll become more
yeah,
dangerous.
yeah,
So that will spread to your country too. I
yeah,
mean, by hoarding all the masks, you've actually made the situation worse, not just for
yeah.
your neighbors, but for you as well, and for
Mm,
everyone.
mm,
So, I mean, in this situation, you can observe that masks were not a zero-sum game. And because of that, I mean, sharing is caring, right? You should
yeah,
should be like, you should
yeah,
share. I mean,
yeah. I
but
think
people
there
don't
was,
understand this. Even in
yeah,
America, like there was lots of confusion because of hoarding.
yeah. And I think kindness should be something which you should express. You also talk
Mm.
about this in one of the chapter, ultra altruism, which is, yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. And yeah, I think there was an instance when I was reading, you were saying that there was something which came up in during COVID was hydrochloroquine, and
Yeah.
you said like, don't even get me started on that. I was using that. That was something like, what was the issue? Like, I also know that there's something which came and people were like, this is like something which is going to solve all the issues. And people just closed their eyes and brains and they were just like blindly following it. What was that?
Yeah. So for anyone who remembers hydroxychloroquine, that was
Mm,
said a lot during one period of the pandemic.
uh,
And that was really confusing because there was
mm,
actually a paper in Lancet, which is quite a
yeah.
prestigious journal. And that paper was later rescinded, actually,
Mm.
because of survivorship bias.
Oh,
So,
okay.
I mean, yeah. So what survivorship bias is, it's actually a selection bias where
Mm,
you focus on surviving subjects of a process and you overlook ones that didn't survive. And this
mm,
leads to false conclusions.
yeah.
So in this actual example of hydroxychloroquine, I mean, in the study in the paper, they had a follow-up period for six
Okay.
days and only if you were present for all 6 days of that follow-up period would you be included as a patient in the study.
Mm,
Now, this is interesting because the people who died in that time,
mm,
or the people who were seriously ill and couldn't be present,
yeah.
they weren't considered. So only the healthier patients were
Uh,
even considered because only they were in the
yeah.
inclusion criteria. And they showed much better performance, but they were
Yeah.
already healthier and they were doing much better to begin with.
Mm,
So it's an interesting situation when death prevented hospitalization rather than
mm.
hospitalization preventing
Sin
death.
prevented death.
Yeah. So we have a small cartoon of that in our paper as well,
Yeah.
but a
Yeah.
fun, yeah.
No, this is actually like really interesting. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. I was also reading about something called Parrondo's paradox. I was not able to like gaze how can we implement this in the real world, but I felt that this is a fascinating idea. Like, can you explain this? What exactly is this paradox, and how can we relate it in our real world?
Sure.
Oh.
So some more game theory. Parrondo's paradox is basically about you can combine two different losing strategies to
Mm-hmm.
create a winning strategy by playing a move from each losing strategy alternatively. So I'm going to
Okay.
explain that to you.
Explain this.
Don't
Yeah.
worry.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. So a strategy is just a series of moves or like what you're going to do. Okay. So suppose losing strategy one is, as a country, you go into complete lockdown
Yeah.
and all ages are in lockdown, and that therefore safeguards the population health a lot, but it comes at the cost of economic health. So we know
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
if the country goes into complete lockdown, the
Mm.
economy completely tanks, right? So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a losing strategy. The second losing strategy that we're going to consider is,
Mm.
what if you open up the economy completely? So it's
Yeah.
completely working. So this is in the
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19 scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you let the population roam completely freely, then the economic health of the country will be great, but the population health will be
Will
low.
go down. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is also not ideal. I mean,
Yeah.
lots of people die, and different countries kind of exhibited either strategy one or strategy two at different times.
Mm.
Now, if we look at what Parondo's paradox says,
Mm.
which is you take each strategy alternatively, alternate them. What you do is, suppose you do a lockdown, complete lockdown for 2 weeks, and then completely open up for 2 weeks, and you keep alternating between
Mm.
the two, it
Mm.
turns out to actually be a winning strategy. So you
Yeah.
can even simulate this. I made up the 2 weeks, but the time period could be different for each country depending on their different factors.
Mm-hmm.
But, if countries had tried to be a bit more innovative
Yeah.
and think outside the box and use these game theory principles to actually combine strategies and
Yeah.
make them more effective, then so many people wouldn't have just followed a losing strategy where either the economic health or the actual population health
Yeah.
was kind of destroyed.
But don't you think, like, with a big population as in India, like, it's difficult to have this kind of strategy because if we do like completely open it for like 2 weeks after closing it for 2 weeks, like there are gonna be like a lot of repercussion we are gonna face because of that, opening up. So what do you think about, like, how does this explain it?
So, okay. So if you look at the spread of the disease, right,
Yeah.
COVID-19, I mean, if I remember correctly, like the incubation period, it would take like probably 2 weeks max. 14 days is
Yeah,
the
14
max
days.
amount of
14 days
time
was a
you could
lockdown.
have
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why I use the example of 2 weeks as well.
Oh,
Because
okay.
if in lockdown, supposing, I mean, less people would get the disease, let's assume. In the two
Yeah.
weeks when you're in lockdown, you're not meeting as many people, less people would get it. In the 2 weeks that you're open, free movement, you will be meeting lots of people. People will be
Mm.
making up for the lockdown time and moving extra, if anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And many people would get it. But then if you go back into lockdown shortly after,
Yeah.
then it kind of controls the spread and it doesn't
Yeah.
become
Yeah. Yeah.
exponential growth
Yeah.
and just keep getting out of control, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
now I get it.
yeah,
Like, if we have a losing strategy, like we are gaining on one strategy once and then other strategy once. So yeah, yeah. Actually, it explains. Yeah, that's a really
exactly.
good example. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there was something which I was reading in the book. It was telling me about the smoking thing, right? You know that smoking might appear
Yeah.
to protect against COVID. There was this news in the market, and I think you mentioned about this as called Berkson's paradox. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, can you explain
Yes.
that? And like that's also really interesting.
Exactly. So, I mean, there was headlines that, smoking prevents COVID, or like smokers are less likely to get COVID. I
Mm,
mean, that sounds pretty counterintuitive. It's a respiratory disease, was
yeah,
right? So, I mean, how does that work out, right?
yeah.
So it turns out there was something called Berkson's paradox at play. So that is the statistical phenomenon where it's again an example of selection bias, and it's
Hmm.
got hidden variables. So it's
Yeah.
when two independent variables,
Mm-hmm.
they appear to be correlated because
Yeah.
of the way the data is collected, but it's collected in a way that, the sample is not representative.
Okay.
So I'll give you the example that was in the book as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So suppose there's a hospital, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And people with smoking related illnesses and COVID related illnesses are all admitted to the hospital. Just to
Yeah.
simplify the example, we'll say they're only admitted for one of these two reasons, either
Mm.
because of smoking or because of COVID-19.
Yeah.
So then within this hospital population,
Mm-hmm.
you'll find that actually most smokers, they tend to show lower rates of COVID-19 because they were hospitalized exclusively for smoking related illnesses and not
Yeah.
necessarily also COVID-19.
Yeah.
So you see an emergent relationship between
Mm.
smoking and COVID-19,
Yeah.
and it seems like smoking leads to having less COVID-19, which is
Yeah.
obviously incorrect.
Yeah.
And so Bergson's paradox like makes you think, makes you see spurious correlations,
Uh,
and this leads to misleading conclusions
yeah.
and can lead to nonsense like this.
No, actually, yeah. This is, yeah. Because I think we didn't pay a lot of attention during that time, and I think this is all the explanation which you gave in the book, which explains, yeah, that was incorrect. That was incorrect. Yeah. All right. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, let's, move on from the COVID-19 stuff. And
Yeah,
I
sure.
really want to focus on the other chapters which you wrote in the book, which was quite interesting. And one of them were like about the social networks. Like you presented the friendship paradox in an interesting way. Like, can you explain that thing, like the friendship paradox?
Okay, I'm afraid to tell you what friendship paradox was also related to COVID, but
Okay.
I'll just finish
Oh,
this
okay.
off and then we can move on from COVID
Sure, sure,
after
sure,
this.
sure. Yeah.
Okay, so the friendship paradox is basically when most people
Mm-hmm.
have fewer friends than their friends on average. Again, I'll explain that, don't worry.
Okay. Yeah.
So, basically, it means that, intuitively, if you think about it, you
Mm-hmm.
know that, a few people have lots of friends who may be extroverts, and most people have few friends whom you can
Yeah.
call introverts for this
Introverts.
example. So if you choose a random person and vaccinate them versus if you choose a random person, choose one of their friends at random and vaccinate them,
Mm.
you find that this latter is actually much more effective since that person is more likely to be an extrovert.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
because I mean, if you think about it, like if I choose you and choose one of your friends at random, they are
Uh,
likely to be many people's friends. So they
yeah.
are more likely to be chosen at random.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
extroverts are more likely to be chosen as a
Yeah.
friend of a friend, right?
Uh,
So it sounds a bit like a tongue twister, but if you think
uh-huh.
about it, it does make sense. And there's a full graph theory explanation too, which I'm not going to bore you with.
Uh,
But it's interesting because this has been used even from 2010 in predicting influenza outbreaks.
okay.
So, they did this, and instead of choosing a random person and checking their symptoms out, they would
Mm.
choose a random person and choose one of their friends randomly and check the symptoms in them. And
Mm.
it turned out to be way more predictive. You could detect the influenza earlier. I mean, that helps lots of situations,
Yeah.
organize medical resources, save people. So
Mm.
it's a nice paradox that comes from like graph theory and social networks, which if you
Yeah.
cross over into epidemiology, it has a lot of interesting impacts. So this friendship paradox about the vaccination is something that
Mhm.
actually we brought over, and
Okay.
we simulated it, and we wrote about it a lot in our paper also in the
Yeah.
deployment section. So yeah, it's
And
interesting.
this means like this should have been done at that time if your study was out.
Yeah. I mean, this
Yeah.
one, friendship paradox and Parrondo's paradox that we were talking
Uh,
about, is
yeah.
something that we wrote about in the pandemic. So
That's interesting. And I
it's,
think both of
yeah.
these concepts like blew my mind. Like when you think deeper into the problem and you like intuitively think about like how it can solve the problem, it
Mhm.
explains a lot. These two paradoxes are like very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really want to like move forward with this concept which you talk about logic versus emotion. And the way you guys wrote it is like, conversation. And the book, the chapter is over. There's a conversation and the chapter is over. So it was really good because I was just engaged in that conversation. Okay, she's fighting for this, then he's fighting for this. And it was funny. It was really, really funny. There was a
Yay.
graphic, I think yeah, I have that graphic in the beginning, like uh the guy like who's I think is he's a therapist, right? The doctor,
Couples counselor,
the
yeah.
counselor, yeah. Doctor let them come in, and there's a sofa which is like uh misplaced, and there's a chair, like small chair, and he's asking, "Thanks for coming in today. Take a seat wherever you feel comfortable." That was funny. So
Yeah, that
in
that
this,
is completely thanks to our illustrator, Alex Liu. He does amazing illustrations.
so this wasn't like the storyline behind this illustration was not your part, right? It was Alex's part, right?
No, the storyline was us. I just mean the illustration was his.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
he
No,
made
it
this
it looks
after the
it's really
fact.
good. Yeah, it looks really good. So yeah, in this chapter, you like talk about how like logic versus emotion thing, within the character dynamics. And I think the story which you use between a husband and a wife, it's a really good example to talk about logic and emotion because it's very important to have a good communication in a relationship because
Hmm.
the way it shapes it, right? And I think you guys
Yeah.
have explained it really well. So can you like shed some light on that? What exactly were you trying to explain?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we all see different couples, different people all the time, and different people mean different things when they say the same thing sometimes.
Mm,
Like some people are very literal, very logical. Some people can be a bit more poetic. And
mm,
this is a cause for a lot of misunderstandings and disagreements,
mm.
and within a family, within friends.
Yeah.
So we try to make a very relatable situation, is why we used a couple going to a counseling session, and they're squabbling
Mm,
in the way that I'm sure many people squabble. And we were trying to show how people can be a little bit more empathetic to each other, and
uh-huh.
give each other the benefit of doubt in a slightly humorous
Mhm.
and fun way.
Yeah.
But the idea is to just kind of try and see things from the other person's perspective as well.
Mm.
Although it
Yeah.
ends, I mean, it doesn't end well, but
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't. Yeah. The way she smashed the door, like the doctor is saying, my doors are always open. Keep it closed. We're not coming
yeah,
back. That was
exactly.
hilarious. Yeah. That was hilarious. And I think, yeah, in when you start this chapter, you mentioned about this quote from Plato, which was like, you can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. Like, how did you incorporate this in this whole story?
Yeah, so it's an interesting quote, and I actually really believe in it, which is
Yeah.
that, if you play a game for an hour, you learn a
Yeah.
lot more about a person than just
Yeah.
by talking to them. I mean, a game can show a person's character, their preferences, and how they emotionally respond to things
Yeah.
rather than just verbal communication. You
Yeah.
learn about how authentic they are, how, their sportsmanship, if they cheat and
Yes.
this and that,
Yeah.
non-verbal cues, their problem solving and how creative they are, their
Mm.
performance under a stressful situation and when they're faced with obstacles. So,
Yeah.
I mean, many times in life, you will have a cognitive load, you'll have
Yeah.
different things going on in your mind while you're trying to do something. So, in these kind of situations, how does your partner act?
Yeah.
So, highly recommend, young
Yeah.
couples to just go out and play a game, test it out.
No, actually, this is something really interesting because I use this technique with my friends, like not in a relationship, but I think friendship is
Yeah,
also a sort of relationship. And
yeah,
when you meet someone and like it takes time to make a good friendship. You
Mm-hmm.
have to build it over the time. And I just realized people seem to form really nice initially in front of you, and eventually, like if you want to really test them, right? Give them a stressful scenario, like give them a chaos scenario, like some where they have to react, and
Mm-hmm.
it like and when then reaction comes in, I personally think that it doesn't matter who is right or wrong. I can be wrong and you can be wrong. It doesn't matter. Like, but how did you react to the situation? That is the thing which matters. And I
Mm-hmm.
know a lot of people fail at it. They react
Yeah.
in a certain way, which like is completely out of my mind. Like, how did you react like that? Even though if I'm wrong, you should have at least like talked and reacted in a better way.
Yeah.
And this tells a lot about a person.
Yeah, you can take it elegantly, or you can be rather, abrupt or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, it's
because
good to.
it's direct contradiction to how you behaved initially with me
Mhm.
and how you are
Yeah.
behaving right now. Then
Hmm.
like it's completely for like I was shocked like when this happened with me in one scenario, and I was like, okay, this is not what I was expecting.
Yeah,
So
so you
yeah,
can put people under the test.
yeah, pressure. Just do some mistake and let them react to it. That's the best way to do it. So yeah, okay. So in I think we are almost covered with the book, and I think it's really interesting. Like, but there's something which I want to talk about, and I was reading a paper on this also.
Hmm.
You wrote about this chapter called Existential Overload, where you talk
Mm,
about like the ethics and morality in AI bots. And I think that's a really good thing to talk about because in this world where AI is growing really big, and like just talking the basics of morality and ethics. So morality and ethics come from a group behavior. Initially, when we were like, this is what made religion into existence because you come up with a common morality and common ethics, and you come up with a group behavior, and then you make a religion out of it. So this is an evolutionary explanation of moral and ethics, which I read in a paper, and I think that guy was a philosopher, and he was doing the similar research on how AI would react on a moral and ethics. Because when we think about moral and ethics, what is right and wrong, it's very different. Some people
mm,
would think that eating non-vegetarian is immoral, and some people doesn't think that. Then how would
mhm,
you decide what is moral and what is ethical? But because both of them are not thinking rationally, they have their own thought process, which is derived from their own evolution. But this is different in the case of AI bots, and I think you guys explained it really good, like because Aizen, who's a character in one of the chapter, makes a like moral decision. So how do you compare his decisions with the humans in the real world? And what is the difference with the ethical reasoning when it comes to, making a decision?
Okay. Um, so Aizen is the robot character, and we put it under a series of simulations to try and test out its morality and ethics, right? So when we were exploring this, I mean, like you said, humans are, they tend to have a lot of emotional triggers and not always be rational. And they'll be biased based on their lived experiences.
Yeah.
So that can be good and bad. I mean, it can also make them more subjective, but it
Mm.
can also make them more flexible to different nuances.
Yeah.
Now, Aizen, which is the robot character, the AI,
Hmm.
that might appear to be more rational and objective and weigh things against each other in a very data-driven manner.
Yeah.
And it can analyze vast amounts of data and produce an answer very quickly. But
Hmm.
it is also limited by the data it has been trained on.
Mm.
And, this creates a situation where it's like, is it better for humans to make decisions? Is it better for the AI? Is it better for a hybrid? I mean, right now, I don't think AI has come to the situation where it's making big, like, defense decisions, for example. They
Yeah.
usually require human oversight. So,
Yeah.
like, for instance, in conflict areas right now, in like
Hmm.
Ukraine and Gaza, as of now, I read in The Economist recently,
Yeah.
a human is still required to give the final go ahead for a drone strike, for instance. But the AI typically will do an analysis and suggest different areas to give the drone strike. So the human
Yeah.
might be choosing from what the AI has already pre-selected.
Yeah.
And as time goes on, it might be that the AI might be left to make more and more decisions on its own, since it can make many decisions very quickly and it
Yeah.
can manage the entire process automatically. It can,
Hmm.
do select sites, it can select a actual site to, land a drone, bomb, whatever it wants to do. It can actually deploy the drone. It can do all of these things automatically. And I find that to be kind of scary
Yeah.
because it's like we're weaponizing AI
Mm.
against humans.
Mm.
And, I feel like we're barreling down this path. And I don't think regulations and AI ethics and stuff have really
Yeah.
caught up and kept pace.
Yeah.
So very soon it'll just be AI fighting AI,
Mm.
and humans are the collateral damage. And it
Actually,
sounds like
yeah.
a very dystopian future,
Hmm.
but it feels like we're going in that direction now, which
Yeah.
I find very scary. So this chapter was trying to, explore that a little as well.
No, actually, I'm also like a bit scared of this concept as a, AI being, because humans are, what makes humans different is their emotional thinking and, how they think differently. Like every human is thinks differently. But when you
Mm-hmm.
basically standardized someone to think, you can't think in a standard way because it completely contradicts the word thinking. And to make decisions, you need to think, and you can't let an AI think on a standard way. So I think this is a huge contradiction for thing, and I don't know how it's going to turn out in the future. But what do you think
Yeah.
about this? Like, it's
I
do you
don't
think that
know. I mean, sorry?
do you think like it's gonna be something which is happening soon?
I mean, I feel very worried when I think about it. I mean, I studied computational models of cognition when I did this semester at IIT Madras also. And
Yeah.
I remember in that we learned a lot of different things. I mean, like the arguments you were saying, which is like, can an AI actually think? Is
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
possible? All these different kinds of questions. How does the origin of thinking come about? And can you teach it to an AI? I mean, you can explore it and talk about it as much as you like, but
Mm.
unfortunately, the people who are actually enacting these things aren't going to wait for us to explore it and find
Yeah.
satisfactory answers.
Yeah.
So feel a bit nervous
Yeah.
about it, but
Yeah.
I don't
And
know
you know what?
what will happen.
Like when I talk to you, it feels like I'm talking to Vash. Like it's same as talking to Vash. Like you talk very similar and in the same style. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the last thing I
Well,
want
she's
to
my
ask.
sister, so yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
hopefully it makes sense.
My brother doesn't talk like me at all. The completely opposite. That's why. Okay, so what do you think is the last thing? Like, what do you hope from readers to take away from this book? This is my last question, Rohan. I think this is something really interesting which everyone should read. And you know what? Let me show this in the camera here also and here also, if they want, where they can like purchase this book in India and US both. Both.
So, I mean, you can purchase it on Amazon. It's available. It's called The Mischief of Math: Short Stories of Clowns, Contortionists, and Court Jesters. And you can find it on Amazon or on World Scientific Publishing website as well. And to answer your question, the one thing that I hope readers take away from this book
Yeah.
is that essentially maths can be fun. But a little more in detail is
Mm.
that, it's extremely relevant today more and more to be able to understand maths because a lot of our narratives are very data driven.
Yeah.
So, this book is trying to challenge and reshape how readers think about real life problems by putting them in
Mm.
those situations.
Yeah.
So, we're trying to encourage both young and old thinkers to
Mm.
embrace maths with curiosity and not
Mm.
intimidation, which is what a
Yeah.
lot of people actually feel.
Thank you.
And, I mean, data is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's intertwined with everything.
Yeah.
So it is up to us to make sure that we can understand it and do justice to our decision making.
Yeah.
And, it's not just like academic gymnastics for an
Yeah.
intellectual. It is necessary for everybody in their
Yeah.
lives right now. So we're trying to train people, but in a fun way.
Yeah, and I think this book is going to stimulate that part of the brain which
Hmm.
leads people to think rational and make decisions by thinking. So yeah, I think this is you did a really good job, and I love the book again. So yeah, thank you so much, Nivedita, for coming in. I think I had a really good time talking to you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I wish
Yeah.
you all the best with it.